Although I loved science fiction, I was just beginning my career and I thought, oh, I'm going to be pigeonholed. And
The actors felt like they were burning inside robot suits that reached over 130 degrees. A 10-year-old boy was left with lifelong trauma after being terrified on set. The hero who once played Zorro had to lie on live television. And the leading lady, once hailed as a symbol of intelligence, was now reduced to serving men. They weren't lost in the galaxy. They were trapped on a Hollywood soundstage where the lights shone so bright they blinded everyone to the pain beneath. In 1965, Lost in Space was born promoted as the American dream in the age of space conquest. A family of astronauts, a ship adrift among the stars carrying faith, science and morality. But from the very first days of filming, that dream began to crack. Behind the cheerful scenes were suffocating tension, conflict, and wounds that no one ever spoke about. And these are 10 moments. The cast of Lost in Space deeply regretted filming 10 times when Hollywood's spotlight wasn't bright enough to erase the real darkness behind the camera. 1. Guy Williams, From Zorro to a Father, Shackled by Hypocrisy.
I'm John Robinson.
Guy Williams was once the very embodiment of justice. The world knew him as Zorro, the masked hero who fought for truth and righteousness. But a few years later, behind the gleaming astronaut suit of Lost in Space, that hero vanished. In his place stood a picture-perfect father, always smiling, always right, always lying to preserve his flawless image. From the very first season, Lost in Space began to change. Serious, thoughtful episodes were replaced with cheap humour, plastic monsters, and hollow dialogue. Williams fought to keep his role dignified. When the writers scripted a scene where John Robinson lies to his wife and children to protect them, he vehemently objected. He's a scientist, a father. He shouldn't lie. That's not strength, it's weakness. CBS's response was cold and final. The American father is never wrong. Williams delivered the lines as written, but inside him something broke. He realised that from that moment on, Lost in Space was no longer science fiction, it was propaganda for an artificial ideal. And he, once a symbol of freedom, had become a tool used by Hollywood to preach moral perfection. Fame couldn't save him from guilt. The audience adored John Robinson, but Guy Williams despised the man he played. In an interview after the show ended, he confessed, "I used to believe a role was where I expressed my convictions. In this one, I had to hide them every day." He called Lost in Space the golden cage, shiny on the outside but with a soul trapped within. The fame kept his name alive, yet it also made him feel like he'd betrayed the real hero inside himself. Years later, after leaving Hollywood to live in seclusion in Argentina, Williams admitted, "It was the most hypocritical role I ever played." For him, Lost in Space wasn't a journey through the stars. It was the slow loss of himself beneath the blinding light of moral pretense. Besides, Williams, his closest co-star, carried a regret of her own, one that came from losing not just a role, but the voice of an entire generation of women in Hollywood. 2. June Lockhart, the woman who witnessed Hollywood's injustice toward its own gender.
And worked on a script for a long time, and it was just never right. And in the meantime,
June Lockhart was born into a family of performers. Her parents were veteran MGM actors, and she grew up among scripts, stage lights and speeches about morality and human virtue. When she joined Lost in Space, she brought with her a simple conviction. Women could be scientists, leaders, equals not just caretakers standing behind men. But 1960s Hollywood didn't want to hear that. From the very first production meetings, Lockhart suggested that Maureen Robinson should take part in scientific missions, handle dangerous situations, or at the very least, hold a star map. The room erupted in laughter before someone replied bluntly, "A woman can't be a believable scientist." From then on, whenever the cameras rolled, she was confined to the galley, smiling, baking, and asking her husband, "Are you sure, John?" While the men explored, fought, and discovered, Maureen Robinson was allowed only to serve meals in space. At first, Lockhart tried to accept it, telling herself that's just the era. But the longer she filmed, the more she realized she was perpetuating a lie. She despised the lie that women were valuable only when they were gentle and obedient. I wanted Maureen to be a model for women, she said, but instead, she became proof of how limited we were allowed to be. By the time Hollywood finally evolved with heroines like Ripley Alien and Dana Scully. The X-Files. June Lockhart was in her 70s. She watched those films in silence for a long while, then quietly said, "If I'd been stronger, maybe Maureen would have been the first to step off that ship." That was her true regret, not the role itself, but her silence when rebellion could have changed something. Throughout her life, she remained kind, gracious, and motherly, the perfect American mum Hollywood wanted her to be. But on that same set for another actor, regret took a different form when genuine affection became a forbidden act. 3. Marta Kristen, the actress who regretted letting Hollywood ban love.
When you look at the show, there are times when we're biting our lips from laughing. I'm trying not to laugh. It was a perfect time for a show like Lost in Space.
In Lost in Space, Judy Robinson was the picture of perfection, beautiful, graceful, and always composed. She smiled at the right moments, gazed wistfully into the distance, and kept an immaculate distance from Major Don West, though everyone on set could feel something real between them, something the script couldn't contain. Marta Kristen once recalled, "We shot some beautiful scenes, glances, a touch, a breath without words. But they erased them all. They were afraid the audience might think of sex. CBS wanted Lost in Space to be a pure family show, which meant one thing women weren't allowed to love. To the network, emotion could lead to misunderstanding morality, so every trace of feeling was cut, leaving Judy Robinson frozen like a smiling statue." Marta later said in an interview, "I felt like a doll in a glass case, pretty but soulless." They were afraid of love, of intimacy, of everything that made people real. She regretted not fighting back, not standing up to say that love is not too dangerous for television. "If I'd been stronger," she said, "I would have kept one look, one touch. But I let them erase my feelings." Years later, when she watched films where women could love deeply and hurt openly, Kristen realised Lost in Space had done something cruel. It turned human emotion into a forbidden act. "I used to think I was the only one who felt lonely. Then I realised we were all forbidden to love in that world." For Marta Kristen, the regret wasn't censorship itself. It was her silent acceptance of a world that outlawed emotion. In the cold vacuum of Lost in Space, love was never allowed to exist, and that emptiness was something no script could ever fill. The show's cruelty didn't stop with her. It would go on to steal something even more fragile, the childhood of a 10-year-old boy. 4. Bill Mumy, a childhood stolen by real explosions.
I would think that any opportunity I would get to get out of there whenever I could, if I were in the robot, I would get me out of here. Cut, fine, let me out of here.
When Lost in Space began filming, Bill Mumy was only 10 years old. With his bright eyes and effortless charm, he quickly became television's golden boy. But behind the camera, his childhood went up in smoke, literally. To capture authentic reactions from young Will Robinson as the spaceship shook, the crew used real explosions, real tremors, and real smoke. No effects, no safety shields. Just a frightened boy standing amid blinding flashes and deafening bangs. Mumy later recalled, "I was really crying. They yelled, 'Cut perfect,' and I was still shaking. No one asked if I was okay." Those explosions stayed with him for years. As an adult, Mumy suffered from chronic insomnia anxiety and noise-triggered panic attacks, what he would later recognize as post-traumatic stress from filming. People said, "I was lucky to be famous so young, but I know what I lost my childhood." Like his character, Will Robinson. Moomy truly became lost in space, not in the cosmos, but in a world of adults who turned his fear into entertainment. He once said, softly during an interview years later, "If I could go back, I'd still be an actor, but I'd ask for one thing. Don't turn my fear into someone else's fun." For Bill. Moomy regret didn't come from fame, it came from growing up too fast just to make the audience believe he was still a child. And while Moomy lost his innocence, another man lost something even deeper, his very identity hidden behind a performance the world laughed at. 5. Jonathan Harris. I regret turning my villain into a joke about myself.
Once I did what I think is a terrible thing in retrospect.
When Lost in Space began, Dr. Zachary Smith was meant to be a minor role, a cold-hearted traitor doomed to die after 5 episodes. But Jonathan Harris refused to disappear quietly. He realised that if he played Smith as written, the character would be forgotten, so he rewrote him right there on set. Harris infused the villain with flourishes of camp, elegant gestures, elongated vowels, and exaggerated fear, until Dr. Smith became unforgettable. I added a touch of foppishness, a bit of humour, some of my real self. They hated it, but the audience loved it, he said. Fans adored his antics, tuning in each week to see Smith shriek or faint in melodramatic terror. But behind the laughter, Harris knew he was walking a razor's edge. In the 1960s, CBS forbade any non-masculine behaviour on television. Every time he played Smith too soft or too close to the robot, the director ordered a retake. Less fussy, John. American men don't act like that. So he performed while concealing lived, while pretending. In a Hollywood that wasn't ready for difference, Harris chose the only rebellion he could, hiding truth inside comedy. Decades later, critics would hail Dr. Smith as one of the first coded representations of a gay man on American TV. But Harris never claimed credit. He simply said, "I was tired of pretending to be someone else. Smith was my only way to exist and also the reason I couldn't be myself." He regretted turning his fear and loneliness into a joke for others. Regretted being forced to choose between being forgotten or being misunderstood. And as he once said near the end of his life, "I turned a villain into a legend. But to do that, I had to betray who I really was." If Jonathan Harris had to hide his truth behind humour, another actor was buried completely, not just inside a role, but inside a machine of metal. 6. Bob May the robot. We sweated and bled to give that machine a soul.
Smoke coming out of the robot, and we thought, oh no, God, we've killed him, you know?
It wasn't a special effect, nor a remote-controlled prop. The Lost in Space robot was real, and inside it was a man, Bob May. The suit weighed nearly 200 pounds, built from metal and hard plastic, with no ventilation system. The temperature inside often climbed above 130 degrees Celsius. Steam rose from his skin, and the hum of studio lights drowned out the sound of his breathing. Bob recalled, "I could smell my skin burning. But if I screamed, the take would be ruined. No one ever saw his face when the cameras stopped rolling. To them, he was just the talking robot, not the man gasping for air between takes." Years later, May revealed that he developed severe claustrophobia and underwent therapy for recurring nightmares of being trapped in darkness. One crew member once joked Bob May died inside that suit, no one's opened it to check yet. But to May, that was no joke. A part of him truly did die inside that metal shell, day after day, until the man who gave life to the machine was forgotten. His regret wasn't the burns or the bruises, it was that people only remembered the robot, never Bob May. At a fan convention, he once told the crowd, "I was the soul of that robot." But when they talk about it, they only mention the voice, the lights, the effects. No one talks about the man who sweated, who hurt, who lived inside. Beneath the studio's blinding lights, Lost in Space created one of television's most beloved mechanical icons. But behind that symbol stood a real man, an actor who sacrificed his health, his identity, and even his recognition. So the world would believe the machine had a soul. And yet another man on that same set chose a different kind of prison. One made not of metal, but of silence, which he carried for 2 decades. 7. Mark Goddard, Major Don West. I hid Lost in Space for 20 years.
I said, I've been a detective and I've been a cowboy. I don't want to be some freak up in space. Thank you.
When Lost in Space first aired, Mark Goddard was in his early 30s, handsome, athletic, and tipped to become television's next big action star. But the show he thought would make him a legend instead made him a joke. As the scripts shifted from serious sci-fi to childish comedy, Goddard became the unwilling star of ridiculous scenes, arguing with a robot, talking to singing plants, or getting lost on a planet made of soap bubbles. He later said, "I thought my career was over. I believed Lost in Space would be the next Star Trek, but it turned out to be a giant playground." When the series ended, Goddard erased Lost in Space from his resume. He declined interviews, skipped fan conventions, and refused to discuss the show that had once made him famous out of sheer humiliation. I was ashamed. I couldn't bear to watch myself arguing with a robot or talking to a shrub. I didn't want anyone to remember Don West. For over 20 years, he buried that part of his life. But time has a way of softening what pride destroys. By the early 2000s, Lost in Space had become a beloved cultural icon, rediscovered by new generations of viewers, and slowly Goddard began to see what he once rejected, that the show had given him not disgrace but purpose. He later wrote a memoir, 3 Years Lost in Space, as both confession and redemption. I hid it because I was ashamed. But the more I hid, the more I realized it was the best part of my life. Mark Goddard's regret wasn't about the show itself. It was about being ashamed of the joy he once gave to others. Because sometimes the worst thing isn't being laughed at. It's mocking the very thing that once made you happy. And just like Goddard, another performer from Lost in Space would never escape its shadow, no matter how far from Hollywood they ran. 8. Angela Cartwright, Penny Robinson, the girl devoured by her own past.
An adventure together, never thinking that it would, take off like it did.
Before Lost in Space, Angela Cartwright was already a child star. She was Brigitte, the sweet little girl from The Sound of Music, one of the most beloved films in history. The world once knew her as a symbol of innocence and joy. But just a few years later, all anyone remembered was Penny from outer space. They called me Penny for decades. I lost my real name, Angela said in an interview. No matter how many other projects she did, audiences still saw the same Robinson girl forever trapped aboard the Jupiter 2, never allowed to grow up. Every fan letter began with, "Dear Penny," never, "Dear Angela." As an adult, she left Hollywood trading scripts for a camera. "I wanted to see the world through my own lens," she said, "not through Penny's eyes." But even after becoming a respected photographer, the ghost of Lost in Space refused to let her go. She was still invited to fanfares, asked to sign posters to smile beside fans dressed as the robot. And she did smiling the same smile Penny had left behind in millions of memories. Angela once confessed during a panel, "I don't regret being in the show. I regret letting it define me. I was an artist. Then I became a symbol. Lost in Space gave her fame, then took away freedom. It was the price many child stars paid to be loved by the whole world, yet never allowed to truly be themselves." And when Angela Cartwright said she had lost her childhood under the studio lights, the man inside the robot suit was living through a moment just as unforgettable and far more painful. 9. Bob May, the robot, haunted by the scene where I attacked a child. In Lost in Space, the robot was programmed to serve and protect the Robinson family. But in one chilling episode under Dr. Smith's orders, the machine turned against the very child it was meant to defend. It was a short scene, but behind it lay one of television's earliest ethical questions about artificial intelligence. Who is truly at fault, the one who commands or the machine that obeys? Bob May, the man trapped inside that 200-pound suit, said he was never the same after filming that scene. I knew it was just acting, but when the robot raised its arm toward Will, I felt guilty. I heard the boy scream, and my heart hurt. The director originally shot the sequence to last nearly a full minute, showing the robot advancing on Will amid flashing red lights. But CBS cut it down immediately, fearing it would traumatize young viewers. American television in the 1960s wasn't ready to show a machine out of control, wasn't ready to see its own reflection in fear. For Bob, May, that moment wasn't just performance, it was a wound. I thought I was creating something magical, he said later. But when I look back, I see a man in armor hurting a child and telling himself it was just his job. Critics would later call it the birth of moral conflict in AI on American television. But to Bob May, it was the moment he stopped seeing the robot as a character and began seeing it as a mirror of blind obedience itself. In Lost in Space, no one was really in control, not the robot, not the actors, not even the directors. They were all puppets of a larger machine, one where art bowed to ratings and morality was just a slogan printed on a toy box. 10. CBS and Irwin Allen, when morality and art were distorted by commerce. After its first season, Lost in Space was celebrated as a bold, humane and ambitious new symbol of televised science fiction. But then, CBS saw something else: money. Toy sales for the robot skyrocketed while production costs were deemed too high for a family show. The network's response was ruthless. They slashed the budget, scrapped the more philosophical and psychological episodes, and forced producer Irwin Allen to shift the tone from a spacefaring drama about human courage into a loud, colourful camp sitcom for children. What began as a revolution became a toy commercial. Guy Williams, who once believed Lost in Space would be the Zorro of the space age, said quietly, "They killed the show, just to sell plastic robots." The rest of the cast understood that everything they had built, its seriousness, its depth, its humanity, had been sacrificed for what CBS called safe ratings. Every episode became a 25-minute commercial for merchandise. Morality was painted over with laughter, and art was twisted by profit. Even Irwin Allen, the show's creator, later admitted, "We weren't making television anymore. We were manufacturing products." Their deepest regret wasn't that they had made Lost in Space. It was that they had stood by as it was consumed, transformed from a dream about humanity and the stars into family-friendly escapism with a price tag. And perhaps that is Hollywood's truest tragedy, the place where those who create magic must watch it being sold by the pound, cast in plastic and shrink-wrapped for profit. When CBS finally turned off the lights, the Jupiter 2 stopped humming and the cast went their separate ways. No one realised that Lost in Space was only then truly beginning to live. Through reruns on flickering black and white televisions in living rooms across America, a new generation grew up with them, with the laughter that falls and the seemingly innocent lessons scattered across the stars. But for the people who made it, the story didn't end. They remained trapped in the very roles that had once defined and wounded them. They had made millions believe that courage, love and morality could survive in the cold vacuum of space. Yet behind the cameras, they knew better than anyone morality can be rewritten. Love can be edited out and childhood can be traded away, all for the sake of a perfect shot. Lost in Space was the story of a family lost among the stars. Behind the lens, it was the story of human beings lost inside Hollywood itself. And perhaps that was the real voyage they never found their way home from. If the story of Lost in Space made you see Hollywood in a different light, let us know in the comments below. And if you'd like to keep uncovering the forgotten secrets of the Dream Factory, don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Because in the next videos, we'll continue exploring the hidden corners of Hollywood that were never meant to be seen.